servos in the right-hand circuit. The single FGS variant accommodates a single autopilot system. The autopilot master switch controls power to the servos and clutches in the left-hand circuit. The autopilot is capable of flying the aircraft from 10 seconds after liftoff through the climb-out, cruise, descent to the approach, and performing an automatic landing, all with 3 or 4 engines operating. The autopilot is engaged by one of the 2 AP Engage Nav 1 or 2 buttons on the MCP. The captain's navigational systems are used by the autopilot as master when it is engaged via the Nav 1 button, the first officers when using the Nav 2 button. Autopilot engagement is confirmed by the AP legend at the FMA in the top right-hand corner of each PFD. The autopilot can be engaged on the ground for testing in the basic modes takeoff and track, but it cannot be used for takeoff. Earliest selection is 10 seconds after weight off wheels. Operation of the autopilot does not require the selection of any flight director, but when a flight director is on, the autopilot's master selection takes priority. The autopilot is disengaged using either of the disconnect buttons located on each control column, which is accompanied by a cavalry charge audio warning, red flashing AP legends in the FMAs, and 2 steady red AP flight annunciators for 0.75 seconds. The autopilot must be switched off latest at 60 knots on rollout following an automatic landing. The autopilot disengages automatically when a fault is detected or when a takeoff with the autopilot on is attempted. In this case, the autopilot disengage warnings, which are the same as for manual disengagement, are continuous until manually canceled by one of the AP disconnect buttons. In an emergency, the autopilot can be disengaged by pulling the paddle switch on the MCP down. The warnings are the same continuous as above. Parallel rudder is a function of the autopilot and needs autopilot engagement. It is active when the autopilot is engaged in track mode, when it provides yaw control after takeoff, during go-around, or wind shear guidance. It is also available when Cat 3 auto land status is achieved by the FGS to apply drift correction during an automatic landing. Parallel rudder is able to apply engine out yaw correction and yaw dampening. Yaw dampers are disengaged with parallel rudder engaged. The auto throttle system within the FGS, in conjunction with FADEC, enables the setting of the correct N1 by moving the 4 thrust levers simultaneously. The N1 is calculated by the FGS, dependent upon the mode of operation and the phase of flight. On the ground, the autothrottle is armed using the AT switch on the MCP and engaged by pressing either of the toggle buttons on the numbers 2 and 3 thrust levers. In the air, the autothrottle is engaged solely by use of the AT switch on the MCP. The autothrottle is disconnected by pressing either of the autothrottle disconnect switches on thrust levers 1 and 4 or by disarming the AT switch on the MCP. The TRP provides the interface between the pilot, the FGS, and each of the 4 FADECs. Oral and visual warnings are provided when the aircraft climbs or descends through 1,000 feet from the MCP selected altitude. A horn will sound for 2 seconds, and an amber lamp next to the altimeter is latched on until passing 300 feet from the selected altitude. When the captured altitude is deviated by more than 300 feet, the horn sounds once, and the lamp flashes continuously until a plus-minus 300-foot envelope is entered again. The whole altitude alert system operates independently of the flight director or autopilot engagement. The single FGS variant has one dual-channel yaw damper with limited rudder control of 2.9 degrees either side to prevent Dutch roll and for turn coordination. Yaw damper selection is via the Yaw Damp Master on the overhead panel. That powers the FGC yaw damp circuit and the actuator at the base of the rudder. When 2 FGCs are fitted, there are 2 dual-channel yaw dampers used simultaneously irrespective of FGC selection. Yaw damper rudder authority is increased to plus-minus 4 degrees. Yaw damper operation is independent of AP-FD selection and gives no feedback on the rudder pedals. Following yaw damper failure in a single FGS aircraft, an amber YD flight annunciator is lit as well as a YD1 FGS advisory. One reset of the yaw damp master switch according QRH is allowed. If the reset is unsuccessful, the yaw damp master switch is switched off and remains off. This removes the amber YD flight annunciators. YD1 FGS advisory will remain illuminated. Observe yaw damper out limits and avoid use of rudder at high altitudes. As a dual FGC system, a single yaw damper failure will not bring on the amber YD flight annunciators. Only the respective YD1 or 2 FGS advisory will illuminate white. No further action is required, and the yaw damper rudder authority is reduced from plus minus 4 degrees to 2 degrees by the remaining dual channel yaw damper. These forms of pitch trim control are provided in the following order of priority. Auto trim as a function of the autopilot. Electric trim is applied by pilots via the split switches mounted on each hand wheel. Flap trim compensation, FTC, during the selection of flaps from 0 degrees to 18 degrees and vice versa. The pilot can apply manual trim when none of the functions above are in operation by turning either of the interconnected trim wheels at each side of the center pedestal. Auto trim. When the autopilot is engaged, the flight guidance computer commands trim tab movements in order to trim out loads from the main autopilot elevator servo. Electric trim is available when the autopilot is disengaged and applied manually by the pilot via 2 split switches on each hand wheel. To activate electric trim, both split switches have to be pressed in the same direction. Whereas pressing of one of the 2 split switches only or both in the opposite direction may cause a fault condition. If both pairs of split switches are operated together, priority is given to the side that was operated first. When the autopilot is on, application of a pair of split switches causes automatic autopilot disengagement. Any internal auto trim or electric trim faults will latch the amber electric trim flight annunciator on both flight annunciator panels and cause an automatic autopilot disengagement. If the autopilot is off, it will not engage. Flap trim compensation, FTC, is active during manual flight only, irrespective of FD selection. It relieves out-of-trim stick forces when selecting flaps from 0 degrees to 18 degrees.